And now we'll have the presentation of Fernando Barros. Fernando is an associate professor at Federal University of Ceará. He published around 33 articles in specialized journals, 4 books, of which I would personally highlight Nietzsche's Musical Thought, which is an amazing work. Fernando also developed a postdoctorate research at the University of Freiburg between 2014 2015 with a Capes Humboldt scholarship, so making him well acquainted with both research groups. So please, Fernando. I think you're mute.
Não é a continuação. Eduardo, boa tarde, obrigado, né? Colegas do GIM, do Brasil afora. Eduardo, eu peço então a sua ajuda, como sempre, para fazer o texto correr. Hallo, ich grüße euch ganz herzlich. Und ja, Freiburg fällt mir manchmal. So, wenn ich den Text auf Englisch geschrieben habe, genau so das gefragt wurde, werde ich ihn auf Englisch vorlesen. I've written the text in English, so as required, I'm going to read it in English too. Ich fange mit der Lektur an. Nietzsche was also a musician. Maybe not the most brilliant one, but definitely a passionate player and a natural-born melodist. He started to attend piano classes at the age of 9, devoted himself very early to the study of Albrechtsberger's fundamentals of composition, and learned to carefully apply the principles of counterpoint and diatonic structuring. Deeply acquainted with Schumann's work and increasingly familiar with the busy harmony of the 19th century, he was likewise well informed about the sound landscape of his own time, full of dissonances, non-prepared seventh chords, and uncanny chromatic arrangements. But first and foremost, Nietzsche was a great improviser, being quite well known for his unique skill. Since his childhood, as Georges Lebert reminds, he's got a distinct taste for improvisations, favoring the free blossom of melodic arches and ad-lib contours. His inventive playing always left a powerful impression on whoever happened to listen to it. It must have been, like Kurt Weill-Young's affirms, very expressive, and plenty of nuances, bringing about a suggestive effect. Of course, the very idea of improvisation can and should be enlarged upon different contexts within Nietzsche's thought, placing us in a wider conceptual framework and deflecting our attention far away from the piano keyboard. At the age of 19, when he was not altogether sure of what profession he should take up, a decision that most probably was never really clear-cut to him, extempore performance and offhanded practice seemed to be major preconditions of his life. By the end of his last school year at Forta, he writes then to his mother and sister, I quote, "But what does it mean to improvise? In many cases, our whole life is sometimes just a poetic improvisation, eine poetische Improvisation, and we must just indulge in fantasy to feel it as such." And a few years later, against the background of the so-called artist's metaphysics, a certain concept of improviser undertakes a decisive role in the transition from music to drama, since tragedy itself should rely on a conflation of visionary choir, charmed spectator, and a sort of generative force embodied by a Dionysian flute player that eventually should be uplifted to the ideal heights of a primordial drama. In this regard, we'll read, I quote, 2 different starting points of the Greek tragedy. The choir which sees the vision and enchanted Eisen improviser, der verzauberte dionysische Improvisator. The choir gives only the living image, and the improviser, in turn, the drama. As a connecting link or a facilitator between the non-figurative realm of sensations and the sphere of representations, the general idea of improvisation emerged as a powerful expressive vehicle towards a deeper subjective experience. So it's no wonder that later on, after having published all his untimely meditations, Nietzsche ends up identifying musical improvisation with a more genuine form of pleasure. While connected with an inner sort of satisfaction, it seems to require a very personal evaluative scale. So he says, I quote, when other things according to the degree of pleasure that they give, that's what stands at the top. Musical improvisation in a good hour, then listening to particular things of Wagner and Beethoven, and then having bright ideas while going for a walk before lunch. Besides, if we are to consider the very act of writing as a cunning result of the artistic organization of our most strong energy currents, music improvisation can also be understood as a pervasive source of inspiration towards an argumentative strategies, and precisely due to its mediating and interpretative character, because of its intervention between our somatic constitution and more refined ways of spiritualization. It really won't be an exaggeration to affirm that the whole stylistic development of Nietzsche's writing could be outlined and described as an overall musical stratagem. At the very beginning of his philosophy, he used to dimension himself, I quote, above all, what must be once more lit in my style are some lively spirits. I must learn to play them as I play the piano keyboard. And not only the pieces I know by heart, but also free fantasies, freie Fantasien, as freely as possible, yet always logically and beautifully. And later on, he seems to have no doubts about the musical mediation between the words he uses. So he says, I quote, the most comprehensible thing in language is not the word itself, but the sound, strength, modulation, and tempo, which a series of words are spoken. In sum, the music behind the words, the passion behind this music, the person behind this passion, and therefore everything that cannot be written. However, being thus characterized as a sensitive writing tool, one might say that the idea of improvisation runs the risk of submerging in the stormy nights of non-cognitivism or some frantic rapture in which music would eventually be exalted to a blind manifestation of telluric forces. But in this case, we shouldn't surrender too fast and so easily to anti-realism. Even by Kant, total music, save as pure time division, was far from being a good candidate to exemplify the aesthetic judgment as a mere play of sensations. So he tells us music wouldn't present credentials capable of protecting itself from sensory contents, being then unfit to create a pleasure solely formed by the representation of its own form. So even by him, the so-called musical fantasies are not totally deprived of free beauty. The very absence of a specific theme or text makes fantasy pieces, in terms of purity, preferable to adherent beauties, which could never be totally free. And in fact, we really don't need to go that far. Even in modern jazz, the very core of music, freestyle improvisation, is not a result of an unbridled laissez-faire or an outcome of a purely non-rational and randomized process. Of course, jazz standards don't depend crucially upon music sheets to be performed or even learned. As dynamic auxiliary means, the lead sheets, where they are normally transcribed, consists mainly of chord signs and melody patterns. So that, as Daniel Feige rightly puts it, I quote, when we transcribe a jazz performance, we are not transcribing a music sheet pertaining to the exhibition of a work, but rather capturing a concrete spatial temporal event. However, this doesn't imply that jazz performances don't make sense at all. The chief difference here is that if compared with traditional music making, the piece of music is created only while being played. In this case, the very stage of having a musical existence depends on what will become music. What the improviser plays, so we read further, is filled with its specific sense only in the light of what will be done afterwards. End of quotation. Here, every note has its meaning only through the scope of all the notes that will still have to be played, or simply won't be played as we imagined. In his own particular way, Nietzsche was well aware of that. To end up a song in a fundamentally different chord than its initial one was a common procedure during the 19th century. But even the most inventive and unpredictable move, made as the music is on, involves some degree of concentration, protocols of decision, and technical proficiency. So we read in a quite revealing passage of Human All Too Human, I quote, it's to the interest of the artist that there should be a belief in certain suggestions, so-called inspirations, as if the idea of a work of art or poetry, the fundamental thought of philosophy shone down from heaven like a ray of rays. But artistic improvisation ranks low in comparison with serious and laboriously chosen artistic thoughts. All great men were great workers, unwearied not only in invention, but also in rejection, reviewing, transforming, and arranging. End of quotation. Indeed, there are different kinds of improvisers. There are those, the hard workers, whose creative powers are tied up with their works and whose diligence makes their works creative. To them, improvisation is an act that happens only while being enacted, following a procedure in which creative and performance music activities, to use the sharp words of Alessandro Bertinetto, I quote, not only occur at the same time, but are the one and same generative occurrence. End of quotation. And on the other hand, there are those who, rejecting the very idea of becoming, associate improvisation with miracles and introduce in their music, I quote, this is Nietzsche, elements of inspired unrest in order to influence the soul of the spectator or hearer, that it may believe in the sudden appearance of the perfect. End of quotation. Perfection can make art products very attractive, especially when they are supported by pressing metaphysical claims. For although the act of listening as well as reading indicate a process developing itself from measure to measure or page to page, the sections of a music piece exist simultaneously in its entirety. No matter where we listen to it, whether in the street or in the concert hall, we can never truly locate a work of art simply because it may exist in many places at the same time. Es geht ein interessantes Thema. Maria Reich hat so ein tolles Buch darüber geschrieben. Das ist eine andere Geschichte. Continue. And no matter, no matter where we listen to it, we probably will be able to locate the work of art. And from this point of view, a given performance would always be a token or an instantiation of the work, and never offering itself in substitution to it. To typify a musical object would be just like a number, discovered and not properly invented, The numerical entities would have always existed, equally eternal and independently from us. This respect, the famous Tristan Port, much like Kepler's laws, was only waiting for Wagner's revelation to gain the world. Subsisting before the German composer had become aware of his thoughts, it would continue to exist if it stopped being played or even remembered. But what would lead us to claim such a huge discrepancy between an abstract music object and its material embodiment, if not the philosopher's old will to truth? Furthermore, what would impel us to deny the musician and the fact of the creative power, if not the habit of submitting ourselves to an almighty creator, the sole composer capable of performing works ex nihilo? Maybe it's high time we consider the world as an improvisational music performance instead of an imperishable work of art. And perhaps that's the fundamental meaning of the word Spielwerk, used by Nietzsche to encourage a deification of nature and the gay science, picturing the world as a giant Musikwerk or a music box that would make use of improvisation as a principle in action, just as live music performance. Like music, nature would be effective only while performing itself. And it doesn't really matter if judged from the point of view of our reason, the universe sounds strange or presents disorder in sonic factors. So we read, I quote, the total character of the world, however, this is a very famous passage. So I read again, the total character of the world, however, is in all eternity chaos, in the sense not of lack of necessity, but of a lack of order, arrangement, form, beauty, wisdom, and whatever other names there are for our static anthropomorphisms. Judged from the point of view of our reason, unsuccessful attempts are by all odds the rule. The exceptions are not the secret aim, and the whole music box, Spielwerk, repeats eternally its tune, which may never be called a melody. Well, one might say, end of quotation. Okay. Thank you, Eduardo. One might say that this is just another way to apply or carry out wrongly the poetic procedures found in Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Katarina. Just another way to shuffle and scramble the functions of poetry and metaphysics by using unscientific sentences or pseudo-statements, if you want to talk about theoretical questions. However, this would be quite naive and tantamount to ignoring that Nietzsche was quite aware of the post-Kantian use of the term conceptual poetry, Begriffsdichtung, especially of the meaning Friedrich Lange gave to it. I quote Lange, we could only poeticize about one absolute truth after we convince ourselves of the relativity of all knowledge. End of quotation. Sounds of nature would never mean by Nietzsche sounds of nature. In this regard, he will then explain, I quote Nietzsche, the domain of metaphysics and consequently the field of the absolute truth has been necessarily aligned with poetry and religion. So to some people, metaphysics belongs to the sphere of soul necessities and is mainly an edification. It is, on the other hand, art, namely the art of conceptual poetry, Begriffsdichtung. However, it should be also remarked that metaphysics has nothing to do with the so-called truth or being in itself, neither as religion nor as art. End of quotation. But Nietzsche has also to avoid explaining purely internal facts with purely internal reasons. The idea of conceiving the external world as the cause of our perceptual stimuli would lead us to a kind of missing link of perceptive conscience. After all, if the body itself is a distinctive part of the external world, and the sensations contained in its perception are relative to the sense organs that they correspond to, their physical existence would have to appear previously validated to us. By considering our senses a byproduct of our organization, we would then fall into the incoherence of taking them as their own cause. That's precisely why later on, Nietzsche would write down, I quote, "To study physiology with a clear conscience, one must insist on the fact that the sense organs are not phenomena, in the sense of the idealistic philosophy. As such, they certainly could not be causes. Sensualism, therefore, at least as a regulative hypothesis, is not, if not as a heuristic principle." End of quotation. Like all experimental and trial and error methods, musical improvisation can also be seen as a technique of learning by doing, and therefore as a heuristic principle. So improvisation as a heuristic principle. And perhaps even as a self-educating technique to improvise our own performance as fallible individuals. At least that's what the author of The Gay Science suggests us, I quote, "Truly, in spite of his youth, this is a great improviser of life who amazes even in the subtlest observer. For he never seems to make a mistake, although he continually takes the greatest risk." One is reminded of those masters of musical improvisation whose hands the listener would also like to credit with divine infallibility, although here and there they make a mistake, as every mortal does. But they are practiced and inventive and ready at any moment to incorporate into their thematic order the most accidental tone to which the flick of a finger or a mood has driven them, breathing a beautiful meaning and a soul into an accident. End of quotation. Well, being like this, its conceptual poetry does not serve for the description of states of affairs or any other real fact whatsoever, aiming only at providing an expression of the whole attitude of a person towards life, or let us say, of our emotional relationship towards the general environment. And if Carnap had any right to say that, I quote, "Metaphysicians are musicians without any musical ability," we shall conclude, and we shall conclude by saying that Nietzsche, being such a talented improviser, certainly was very different from any self-deluded metaphysician, not at all a depressing theorist. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Fernando, for this wonderful presentation. So we open again to questions. As I said before, the speakers can place the question directly, and the audience through the chat.
Okay, yeah, the chat. Mm-hmm. Oh, Ivo, thank you. I have to read, okay.
If you wanted, Fernando, I can read it.
Yeah, thank you. I very much appreciate.
So it's a question for Ivo Alebic. Thank you for this beautiful presentation. My PhD dissertation is Life as an Art in Philosophy of Friedrich Nietzsche and Soren Kierkegaard. So I would like to ask you this question. In the context of Nietzsche's work, can we compare musical improvisation to life itself? Because life is elusive, just like music, and music is constantly evolving, just like life. If we can, please elaborate. I think it could be helpful for my thesis.
Shall I answer him here? Yeah, okay. Yeah, Angel, thank you very much for your compliment. Yeah, that is precisely what Nietzsche does. I think, to my mind, yes, we can do that, such a comparison. But the main problem is that I think uh, we couldn't help giving a sense, a meaning to our improvisational conception of life. And the problem is that we only can do that before all the light of what will be done afterwards. We have to wait. Yeah? We are improvisers in life, but we have to wait till the end to make a meaning of it. In German, we would say or in French, maybe this rückwärts Art und Weise zum Sehen. Ne? Diese Heteroação, Portuguesisch, if you want to. That's the main problem. The meaning must be seen through the scope of the all notes that still have to be played in order to make any sense to us. And that what makes this conception of music, of improvisational music, to my mind, very useful to understand as a poetical conception, as a Begriffsdichtung, the way Nietzsche sees things. That's the way. That's what life is. Life is a huge and a big musical, improvisational music. But the problem is that, as I said, we have to wait. We have to wait to see what the improviser is doing. What is being played now? We don't know, because we just belong to it. We are improvisers too. And when it comes to an end, then we can eventually see, oh, that's what happened. Maybe some notes haven't been played. We don't know. Maybe it's only a pause, silence. It belongs to the improvisation to being silent. But anyway, that's the problem. You must wait to give a meaning to it. I'm not altogether sure if I answered you rightly. Okay.
So thank you, Fernando. So there is still another question from the speakers. Andreas?
Many thanks also from my side, Fernando, for this marvelous talk. We are really sad that you are no longer in Freiburg, and we hope you will come back soon. I think it is the most interesting approach to reconceptualize Nietzsche's ways of thinking by this idea of improvisation. The only question I would like to ask is whether you do not focus too much on the music on Menschliches allzu Menschliches, where we have one of the quotes you also showed us. And then I checked the encyclopedia by Meyer, and there the article on improvisation begins not with music, but with painting. Reynolds, the famous 18th century English portrait painter, used the term improvisation for his own sketchy way of, well, beginning a painting, obviously. And I think this would fit perfectly with that, what you told us about Friedrich Albert Lange. And it is also possible to combine that with the very first use of the word improvisation in Nietzsche's letters. You also quoted it, but you only quoted, well, let's say half of it, poetische Improvisation. But just before this, Nietzsche speaks about Professor Berman as an improvisator, and he was not a musician at all, but he talks about mathematics, obviously. So this Professor Berman was able to improvise just well, out of nothing, also in a scholarly way. So obviously the phenomenon of improvisation is from the very beginning on not restricted to music and doesn't even necessarily derive from music, but is much broader. But I think this is a strong argument also for your reconceptualization of Nietzsche's, as I pointed out, ways of thinking and of speaking as an improvisative strategy.
Yeah, thank you, Andreas. Yeah, I know. Well, yeah, to be perfectly honest, I just chosen this way, but I'm pretty aware of it. We might also, if we should, deal with this conception well connected with the ideas of perspectivism to in a more epistemological way of dealing with it, and maybe the very idea of interpretation by piano playing can also shed some light into the philosophical idea of interpretation. I think, for instance, about the letters between Nietzsche and Karl Fuchs, for instance. But it's another. So this is another thing. I pretty much thank you for this reference to this, let's say, plastic world, pictorial world. And the reference to this professor, this mathematician, it's, yes, I left it aside, but I know that ich bin darüber, ich weiß das, ne? Bescheid. Und, sorry, Andreas. Und, but what is maybe what I should, I'm gonna have to think about it. I think it's worth thinking about the way through which Albert Lange thinks on this idea of intuitions. This is spatial intuition. I think, for instance, this logische Studien. I mean, by the end of it, Lange, it's pretty emphatic. It's pretty keen on the idea that all mathematical proofs, as well as this geometrical thing, they all a priori, diese assertorischen Behauptungen, they all are based on a spatial intuition from which everything in time and space, and then we're going to have to think about improvisation too. It's given to us beforehanded by this spatial intuition. And spatial intuition, considering the tradition in which music has been defined, has nothing to do with. Music is a time art. It's a timely art. But but quite the contrary, if we pick and choose this path, we're heading off to a specialization of music, of improvisation, of method, of geometry and mathematics too. So time will be like a secondary thing for us. And when it comes to music, it's such an uncanny way of thinking. But thank you. I'm going to have to think about it. I'm sorry. Maybe I didn't answer you rightly, but thank you, Andreas. Wie immer. Ich bedanke mich dafür.
So we still have a question from Sebastian.
Okay.
Thank you, Fernando. Thank you, Fernando, for your interesting talk. My question is about the Spielwerk metaphor, the music box metaphor. Okay. And it seems a little bit odd to me that Nietzsche is using that metaphor in Gay Science 109. because the text argues against aesthetic anthropomorphisms. And my question is, isn't the music box metaphor an aesthetic anthropomorphism too? What do you think about that? Why Nietzsche is using that metaphor in this text, where he argues against such aesthetic anthropomorphisms?
Well, in my defense, I could say that it's ironically put. But I don't know, I think it's not only you're right in your question, it's absolutely meaningful, and I think it's contradictory. And it's not only it's tactical, but it's also mechanical too. Because a music box must be, in a way or in another, someone has to put their hands on it and roll it up in order to. Who is charging it? Who is it's not a living being in the world. So who is turning this music box a sounding machine? This is one thing that we should think of. But in the context of this passage, also ich gehe nicht in also if I'm not mistaken, as it's a discussion with Kaspari and all this rather this physicalist thing, and I think maybe it's an approach. Because Nietzsche has in a way or in another to use some image that pretty much can be adapted to this horizon. And I think music box pretty much against mechanicism. It's also an image that can, from inside out, have some benefit. Well, I wouldn't say how to. I wouldn't know how to answer you in a way. I just have to think about it. But it's definitely a puzzling thing. Yeah, I can hear you.
Especially because the text is arguing against mechanical worldviews too, not only against aesthetical anthropomorphisms, but especially against mechanical worldviews.
Even, you know. Yeah.
So we have to think about it.
Yeah, and I think this is we could develop. I didn't focus on this aspect, but yeah, it's mechanical. This critic on the mechanistic way of thinking. It's all around in this passage. You know, it's all around. It has to do with the eternal recurrence of the same two. I have to avoid that, because if I start thinking of it, the whole idea of improvisation, it's just for the dogs, let's say, because if everything repeats, well, it makes no sense to talk about improvisation, because an improvisation piece, whatever, in music or in life, just can be repeated, as it were, in a way. I mean, it occurs only once. That's the very idea of it. I have to think about it too.